one last speaker. We have the honor of having a Talmid Chacham, a true Talmid Chacham with us. I grew up with him for a few years in the Sephardic Rabbinical College. Now he's a rabbi in West Steel Shul. He will be teaching us Sefer Yeshaya. And we have the honor of Rabbi Albert Setton being here to give us a few words of introduction to Sefer Yeshaya.
B'rshut my teacher, Rabbi Setton, B'rshut Marad Atra, Kahal Kadosh. I just want to give you a tip on what you should be looking for when reading Nevi'im Aharonim as opposed to Nevi'im Rishonim. But before I do that, I feel that there's something that needs to be said. And if you asked me, why would you volunteer to do Yeshayahu 66 Perakim? And the answer is really very simple. I probably never believed I would actually be doing it. And in all honesty, I don't mean to be funny though, because when Jesse randomly brainstormed this program, I'm like, okay, I'll do Yeshayahu, Jesse. You got 150 Perakim, no problem. And this idea of getting all the people who I'm looking at in the room tonight to come together, besides the accomplishment of actually learning the Nevi'im Rishonim within itself, but the idea of the connections that have been forged among these people in this room. And I think back to myself, there was a time, 6-7 years ago, when me and Jesse Salem were sitting by and large by ourselves with Adam Harari, learning Masechet Ketubot with Rabbi Setton, and there wasn't anybody else you could talk to about learning Torah. It didn't exist. And if you'll notice something here, if you take the older generation out of the room, me and Jesse are the oldest people here. And there's something to be said. There's something to be said about creating a young generation who've come together, who have found each other to come together and learn Torah together. It's not something that was very evident 8 years ago. It's really not something that's simple at all. And really, by and large, probably the only reason this happened is because, if you know Jesse, he could be a little bit annoying. The rabbi was being polite when he said the word persistent. But it's really something that we should all owe a hakarat hatov, besides the actual learning, but the creation of this Torah community to Jesse, and a 66 perakim is the price I have to pay for my lack of belief. It's really, in honesty, a very small price to pay. Thank you very much, Jesse. Nevi'im Aharonim is really going to be very different than Nevi'im Rishonim. And if you never really read it before, there's two major differences. Number one, there's not really, by and large, especially when you go through Yeshayahu, there's no stories. The stories are out of the picture. But secondly, the language is going to be much harder as well. It doesn't read, it's much more, especially Yeshayahu, it's much more poetic, it's much more flowery. And you have to approach it with a different focus. And I want to suggest the following based on the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. And the Gemara in Masechet Megillah talks about how there were many Nevi'im who came in the history of the Jewish people to give prophecy. But the ones that were chosen to be written down, L'Dorot, are the ones that have a message for all generations. That they're not just L'Sha'are, they're for L'Dorot, for all generations. And when we're going to read Sefer Yeshayahu, and you're going to read about Ashur, and you're going to read Yirmiyahu, and you're going to read about Bavel, and you're going to deal with these things that seemingly happened over 2,500 years ago, you always have to take a step back and try to see this nevu'ah is not meant just l'sha'ah. It's meant l'durut. It's meant there's a message here from these nevu'ot that I'm supposed to take away. And by and large, there's two kind of very different types of nevu'ot that Rabbi Harari mentions, the tohiha and the nehama. And the tohiha, it's kind of easy. I kind of understand what I'm supposed to take away. Because you're going to read the rebuke of the Nevi'im, and you're going to see we probably have a lot of the same problems in society today. Human nature is not very different than it was back then. So it's kind of easy to take away the message. But the nehama, when Yeshayahu particularly is just giving these grand visions of the future and the good times, it becomes a little bit harder. Because he's not telling me to do anything specific. And what I'd like to suggest is that we read the Hamishah Hamsheh Torah, you get 613 individual mitzvot. By and large, with the exception of maybe a couple of Pesukim, Parashat Hanan, and this concept of Mamlechet Kohani V'Goy Kadosh and Parashat Yitro, I don't really know how it's all supposed to come together. I don't understand where it's all supposed to go. For some reason or another, Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about Hi chokhmatchem ubinatchem le'aynei ha'amim in Parashat Hanan. But I don't really understand what that means. And all of a sudden we open the Nevi'im Aharonim, and it lays out a roadmap and a role of the Jewish people. What they're supposed to do, each and every single one of us is supposed to be within a Jewish society, how a Jewish society is supposed to look like, how it's supposed to run, and how it's supposed to deal with the world around it. And all of a sudden, these are ideas that after 1948, and perhaps it's apropos that the week of Yom HaAtzmaut, we begin the study of Nevi'im Aharonim, they're not something that's really in the air anymore. It's not some grand ideas and visions Yeshayahu was having. It's something that each and every single one of us has a responsibility of trying to make a reality on a daily basis. The way we're going to run a country according to the concept of Tzedakah Mishpat. The way we're going to treat the people, the underprivileged people in a society. All these ideas, you read about them in the Nevi'im and you say, these ideas are talked about? Okay, God says do justice, but what does that mean? And then you could really relate the messages to a society, and perhaps there's one idea that really burns and shines very brightly throughout the book. And that is, when you read it, you realize the book of Yeshayahu is telling you, if there's one message you're going to take away, it's that the Torah wasn't meant to be implemented in individual communities. It was meant to be implemented by a nation in their own land, in their own country, an independent sovereign nation. And there's no way you could go through Yom HaAtzmaut without having that understanding of what the ultimate end game of the Torah is supposed to be, what these words, Mamlechet Kohani V'Goy Kadosh, when we receive the Torah and Shavuot, what they really mean. And it's something that you're going to read it, you might cry at times, you might get emotional, but I assure you, if we take these lessons properly, we put them together, it'll help us create a great Jewish nation. Thank you.